Antonio Guterres believes that the unity of certain members of the Security Council is key to resolving the North Korean nuclear crisis, which he believes is the most dangerous issue facing the world today. Speaking exclusively to SABC News in New York ahead of this year's high-level UN General Assembly, he expressed a view that unity between China, the US and Russia is essential if North Korea's nuclear ambitions are to be stopped. Guterres also praised the Supreme Court decision in Kenya to order a rerun of the presidential poll, defended the UN's consensus-seeking approach to the world's problems, and shared his personal perspective on the political divisions that are testing South Africa's political and economic landscape.
You mentioned this week that the most dangerous crisis we face today is one of nuclear risk as it relates to the DPRK. You mentioned the need for a united Security Council, a return to the six-party talks, and yet we're dealing with a country, you'll agree, that appears to listen to nobody, and absolutely no one, and dismisses international norms. How do we realistically thread this needle when so many attempts and so many resolutions have only brought us closer to nuclear conflict?
It's my deep belief that if there is a total agreement in the Security Council about the need to stop the process and to make sure that we reach the denuclearization of North Korea, if it is possible to have at the same time the key countries that are involved, of course South Korea and Japan, but essentially the United States, China and Russia, if they decide that indeed it's not acceptable to have North Korea with nuclear weapons, and if they act together, I believe that together they have the instruments of pressure that are necessary to make sure that North Korea gives up. Of course, that means that beyond everything that is being done, that beyond all the pressure, beyond the condemnation of these continued violations of international law, between the demand that North Korea denuclearizes, I think it's also important to have, and again, it requires the unity of the Security Council, diplomatic capacity to reach a political solution and to create the conditions for this part of the world not to be a problem anymore.
I read a very interesting opinion piece in one of the newspapers today here in the United States that basically raises the question, should the world not perhaps just ready itself for accepting North Korea as a nuclear state, just as it has with the other 8 nuclear states we have today? What's your response to that?
It is clear that there are, from the point of view of the international community and from the point of view of the Security Council, decisions that must be implemented. I mean, if we organize our life in a way in which whatever is decided by the international community unanimously doesn't matter anymore, it's not North Korea. We'll see nuclear arms appearing a little bit everywhere, and all the efforts that were made, for instance, for the agreement with Iran and for a number of other very important decisions that were taken. I remember when Brazil and Argentina gave up on nuclear weapons, all these will be lost, and all of a sudden we will see the proliferation of these. These are not toys, these are things that are weapons of mass destruction and that can destroy not only people but that can destroy the planet. Have
you ever spoken to Kim Jong-un?
No.
What will it take for your level of engagement to go up, if it can even go up?
No,
possibly a trip to Pyongyang.
I'm ready to speak with whoever is necessary to be useful. But I am also perfectly convinced that the key actors in making sure that a solution is possible are at the present moment the members of the Security Council and those countries that have been in the 6-country talks platform directly involved. But I have offered myself to support whatever diplomatic initiative might be taken in order to make sure that we reach this objective, the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
You mentioned the word unity in one of your responses, and this leads me to my next question. The words consensus and collective action are often associated with any major decision here at the United Nations, whether you're talking about the General Assembly, whether you're talking about the budget debate, whether you're talking about the Security Council, where often the consequences are life and death. And yet, Secretary General, consensus seems to be harder and harder to find. The international community, having failed in Syria, was due to a lack of consensus. You can argue that the reason South Sudan doesn't have an arms embargo today, despite your calls for one, is because of a lack of consensus. Ban Ki-moon, your predecessor, said this: essential action and good ideas have been blocked at the UN due in the name of consensus. What do you say to those who argue that seeking consensus does not alleviate suffering, that it actually undermines what is necessary, while at the same time tarnishing the image of the United Nations?
Well, we have institutions. Those institutions work based on rules. And we have a Security Council that is still based on the rules that were created after the Second World War. We have, as you know, 15 members, of which 5 are permanent. Those 5 have a veto right. Now, we see the international community divided. We see the Security Council divided. We see how difficult it has been to achieve results in many vital areas. And this has paralyzed the UN in many aspects, and that had very negative consequences on many of the conflicts that you have mentioned. But here, we are talking about a nuclear threat. And if you remember, even in the moment of the Cuba crisis, there was a possibility for the United States and for the Soviet Union of the time to understand that it was necessary to stop. And so it is my belief that even with all the difficulties to reach a consensus at the Security Council level that sometimes exists, the risk here is so high that I believe there is the obligation and I hope the possibility for those key actors to be in agreement, to be able to, working together, stop this threat.
Is it fair to assume from that response that we will not see Security Council reform in your lifetime or in my lifetime?
No, I'm still convinced that there will be no reform. I'm totally committed to the reform of the United Nations, make it more effective, more cost effective, more nimble, more able to respond for the people to feel that the United Nations are working for them. But there will be no reform of the United Nations that will be complete if we don't reform the Security Council. As I mentioned, the Security Council was formed after the Second World War and still abides by the rules that were established at that time. The world has changed completely. It would be good to have a Security Council more representative of what the world is today. But I am also aware that this is a difficult reform to make because it will require the positive vote of the 5 permanent members.
Which leads me to say it probably won't happen.
Which makes it difficult, but hope is the thing that we should never lose.
Secretary General, do you believe that the Security Council adequately responds to violations of human rights, violations that often lead, as you've said many times, to protracted conflicts? How do you see the way forward in the relationship between human rights, the role of the Human Rights Council, and what happens around that horseshoe in the Security Council?
I think that we have today a serious problem in the world in which many times the human rights agenda and the agenda of national sovereignty enter into conflict. And we see the Security Council many times paralyzed not to take action when there are very serious human rights violations because the Security Council is afraid, or some members of the Security Council are afraid that that can translate itself into the violation of the national sovereignty of a country. And the argument that is used is at attention because sometimes this in the past has been done with hidden agendas, with a regime change objective. So this contradiction is there. But I believe it's necessary to understand that a crucial element of national sovereignty is the protection of the country's citizens. And it is my deep belief that we need to make sure that the human rights agenda is not sacrificed to the agenda of national sovereignty, and the two agendas are combined in a way in which we are able to be much more active and much more effective in making sure that the risks of genocide, the risks of ethnic cleansing, the risks of terrible other violations like war crimes or crimes against humanity, that those risks are really eliminated in our world. So unfortunately, we are not there. Unfortunately, we are seeing those risks. And just look at today's situation in Myanmar and you understand how dramatic are the situations we face and how difficult it is today to mobilize, namely the Security Council, in order to put an end to this kind of risks.
A UN Commission of Inquiry report today reveals that government forces in Syria have used chemical weapons more than 24 times in the civil war. A separate UN Commission of Inquiry report this week said there was strong evidence that crimes against humanity, as you've just mentioned, were committed in Burundi by government forces, including rape, torture, killings. The report recommends the ICC immediately open a case. Will anything come from these reports? What do you believe, Secretary General, should happen next in terms of these two reports?
Well, first of all, I am a true believer in international criminal justice. And I think that the ICC was a very important step forward. And I believe that wherever the ICC has jurisdiction, which, as you know, doesn't happen everywhere.
124 countries.
But wherever the ICC has jurisdiction, I think that is the appropriate way to deal with these situations and to move forward. I mean, there is a report. The report indicates a number of possible violations of this sort. The ICC should have, through its prosecution, the capacity to investigate and then to bring to trial and to take the adequate decisions. This is the right way to do it. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, not all countries are covered by this mechanism. There is a way to overcome this difficulty, but that requires a Security Council decision. And what we have seen is that the Security Council has been shy on using its powers in these situations. I think that when we come to moments in which the violations become absolutely atrocious, I would appeal for the Security Council to understand the need to allow for the ICC to play its role.
Of course, Burundi initiated a year ago its withdrawal from the ICC.
But Burundi is still a member of
until
the ICC.
October.
And so there is still a possibility, that depends on the ICC, there is still a possibility for the ICC to start a process.
Let's stay in Africa, Secretary General. We're close to a December deadline for elections to take place to replace President Joseph Kabila in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We have seen violence spread to areas that were not known to have violence, particularly in the central Kasai region. We've seen the brutal slaughter of 2 UN investigators and a lack of clarity from the Electoral Commission as to when the elections will be held. Have we seen this movie before?
Yes, we have seen this movie before, and I think it's important that when we have a movie like this, that we make sure that it doesn't end in a tragedy. I mean, looking at the DRC is a very fragile country. Its economy is in a very difficult situation. There are risks to the social cohesion of the society, risks that are very serious. And I believe that those that have a political responsibility in the DRC need to do everything to make sure that the situation doesn't get out of control. I think elections are necessary. I hope that they will come sooner rather than later. I understand that now there is a feeling that they will not be able to be held until the end of the year. I hope it will be possible to do it as soon as possible afterwards.
So you're open to that?
I believe the Electoral Commission, the Electoral Committee has been working hard. That was the information we got in relation to the registration, including now in the Kasai. So I think that there will be no technical pretext not to have elections, if not at the end of the year, at least in a reasonable moment afterwards. And I do believe it's absolutely essential to have those elections, and I do believe it's absolutely essential to respect the Constitution and to create the conditions for the country to be able to overcome the present crisis.
You will have also seen the Supreme Court decision in Kenya to overturn the election result there, despite the clean bill of health the process got from many observer missions, including the African Union, the Commonwealth, the Carter Center in the United States. Said one observer, the AU, for instance, and the various regional economic communities like SADC consistently prioritize stability in pronouncing on election processes, favoring the incumbent elite rather than their challengers. So it raises the question, Secretary General, is the world, or has the world started to lower the bar on what is acceptable in an election in the name of peace and stability?
I hope not. And I think what has happened in Kenya, I don't know the details, but I understand that the Supreme Court has decided, based on a number of aspects related to the way the rules are established, that demonstrates the vitality of the Kenyan democracy. I mean, it is independently of whether this decision is or not. I'm not judging the decision. I'm saying, it's good to have a country in which the government wins the election, but there is a judicial authority that is sufficiently independent to decide that elections need to be repeated, independently of the merits of the decision.
Right.
And this proves that democracy in Africa is something that can exist, and in my opinion is the best way for African countries to move in the direction not only of peace and security, but also of prosperity for African peoples. I am a true believer in the enormous potential of democracy in Africa, and I would say South Africa, and we are in a South African TV station. South Africa is a fantastic testimony how a country coming out of an apartheid regime with all the divisions that could be imagined, I mean with all the hatreds that had been built, was able to forgive and to create the mechanisms of a democratic society. I think this is extraordinary, and I am a true believer in the potential of democracy in Africa as everywhere else in the world.
I would, though, add, Secretary General, in South Africa, that though that potential that you talk about in South Africa is certainly being tested. I mean, there's the African National Congress, the ruling governing party is going to an elective conference in December, and there are many factions and about the economic position of South Africa, the future of the country politically and economically. What's your sense when a young democracy like South Africa gets to this sort of pivotal fork in the road?
Well, I think it is. I mean, I lived in my country in a dictatorship. And then we had the revolution of the carnation that allowed Portugal to be a democracy and allowed for the Portuguese colonies, for the liberation movements to manage to have their projects become a reality, and for our former colonies to be fully independent. And I have to say that our democracy had difficult moments. We went through difficult moments. We have, for instance, in the recent years, economic problems, economic difficulties. But I can tell you, I mean, nobody in Portugal today can imagine to live in a different society, but in a democratic one.
I have to ask you a developmental question. We're 2 years into the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. A UN report from the Department of Economic and Social Affairs this year called on stakeholders to increase the pace of implementation if the targets are to be achieved by 2030. What do you see as the major impediments to success by 2030?
Well, first of all, we need to understand that it's much more difficult to implement the Sustainable Development Goals that are a comprehensive response to the development problems of the world than the Millennium Development Goals that were just 8 targets related to 8 specific things, in which it was much more easy to mobilize resources, capacities and attentions. Mm-hmm. Here, what we are asking is for coherent development processes everywhere, led by member states and with the support of the international community. I would say that there are 2 central aspects that are essential to make sure that the goals can be achieved. The first is in relation to the governance capacity of countries, in relation to the possibility of countries to assume the leadership of their own development process. And the second is to have a fair globalization. It's to have mechanisms that allow for justice in international relations to prevail, and for the financial mechanisms that are necessary to be mobilized to support the developing world in achieving these goals are effectively mobilized.
Final question for you, Secretary General. This will be your first UN General Assembly as Secretary General, and I know we often ask you about the United States President Donald Trump, so why not once more? This will be his first UN General Assembly. What advice would you give him in terms of what to expect from the United Nations?
Well, it's not my role to give advice. What I'm saying is...
What would you like him to know about the UN?
We want to have a constructive relationship with every government in the world, including the United States. But my deep belief is that the best way to protect American interests is to engage multilaterally in the world, because no country alone, not even the United States, can solve the dramatic challenges that we face, be it in climate change, be it in the global economy, be it in relation to peace and security, be it in relation to terrorism, be it in relation to migratory movements. No way a country alone, even if it's a very powerful country, can solve these problems if there is not international cooperation and if there are not multilateral institutions able to mobilize all efforts to achieve common goals.
And climate change is real.
Climate change is one of the major threats we face today, and I'm a strong believer that the world needs to come together to make sure that the Paris Agreement is implemented, and with increased ambition, because the Paris Agreement is not enough to guarantee that the temperatures will not rise above the 1.5 to 2 degrees that were set as a limit that we cannot afford to not to respect.
Secretary General, there are a lot of handshakes coming your way. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
The 9th Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, speaking to SABC News here at the United Nations in New York.